Morning. We'll be doing this in English, of course, because we've got the great honour of having David Miliband here. I'll just do a brief introduction to who David is. His nickname as a young politician, I believe, was Brains. Shot to fame and helped write Tony Blair's speeches in the New Labour and the New Labour Manifest in 1997. He's been head of Blair's Policy Unit, Environment Secretary, and under Gordon Brown, Foreign Secretary. Would not be wrong to say that this is one of the most influential politicians, I think, of his time. I've had the pleasure of listening to David Miliband speaking quite a few times. Once he and his little brother Ed were outlining the UK's plans for becoming the greenest government on earth, and lead by example at COP15 in Denmark. I, in London, cheekily asked David Miliband what exactly the UK had to teach Denmark about going green. First, Ed Miliband started laughing, then some other people in the room, and finally David joined in. For years, he was thought as the natural heir to Tony Blair. He was seen as a renewer of the New Labour idea, though he actually, I think, belongs to what was called the Primrose Hill Gang. Some said, well. A few years ago, I witnessed a political drama of truly Shakespearean nature when David and Ed Miliband were fighting it out to become Labour's new leader. David had been the clear favourite all along, but brother Ed got the backing of the all-important unions, among other things, and won the vote. I was in Manchester when this happened. A gasp went through the gathered press behind the stage in Manchester when the result was announced, and your senior BBC correspondent turned around to me and said, "I can't believe it, they picked the wrong brother." I don't think that's quite how it stands today, but it was certainly the feeling in the UK back then, a big shock that it was actually little brother Ed and not big brother David.
I was so looking forward to this event, and I'm
Today, David is an MP, still maintaining his interest in both foreign and domestic issues. Whenever there's a crisis in Labour, his name, of course, will always come up as a potential new leader again. But David does a great work both on foreign and domestic policies. He's also the vice chairman of Sunderland FC. Though originally billed as a speech on the British media, a lot has happened in the world since this summer, including the US presidential election, a change of the guard in China on its way, continuous problems in the EU, and several media scandals in the UK. The last one leading to Director General of BBC's quitting his job just 54 days after taking it on. I believe David's speech will touch on some, or if not all of these subjects. Please put your hands together and say welcome to David.
Jacob said to me beforehand, I will just say you need no introduction. And I said, whatever you do, don't say that. Because the first time I was made a minister in 2002, I was made minister for schools, and I arrived in the department on the Wednesday, and they said, you must go and meet teachers and parents and pupils and show that you're a man of the people. And I said, look, don't worry, I'm going to my constituency on Friday, and I'm going to do a school visit to St Mary's Primary School in South Shields, my constituency in the northeast of England. All of the national media can come, they can see me in a natural habitat, it will all be fine. And I arrived at the school, the headmistress says to me, come on, the children are waiting for you, come in, and she walked into the hall, a bit like this. So the children were sitting on their bottoms with their arms crossed and backs straight, and she said, children, our guest today needs no introduction. That's why some of you will have guessed why I fear this. And of course, total silence. She says, now children, anyone tell us who our guest is? Still silence. And then she says the immortal words, children, we did practice this yesterday. And still this great visitor who needs no introduction is standing there, sort of arriving with a big head and now with a smaller head, and the poor headmistress, and she says, look children, we've waited a long time for someone who's going to make such a difference to our school, someone who's really going to help us achieve the ambitions you've got, someone who's really going to make a difference, because you know what I think you can achieve, it's so much more, and this man's going to help. And finally, this little boy puts up his hand and says, "Miss, is it the man who's come to fix the electricity?" As long as you say almost anything is better than saying, "Our guest speaker needs no introduction." Look, there's a lot to talk about. The extraordinary changes going on in the world. I just want to talk for 20 or 25 minutes about four things. Jacob asked me to offer some reflections on what's going on in British journalism. I want to talk, secondly, about why does the world seem so leaderless at the moment? What's going on in international politics? Thirdly, I want to look at why has the financial crisis not been better for the centre-left? Because many people assume that at the time of financial crisis it would necessarily mean left-wing parties would win everywhere. And the fourth thing I want to talk about is why Europe is still the future, even for Britain and for Denmark. And so then we have, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes of questions afterwards. Let me just start with extraordinary time in British journalism. I mean, like politicians, journalists like nothing more than talking about themselves, and so there is a huge amount of flagellation going on in the British media about the resignation of the Director General of the BBC on the back of two wrong Newsnight decisions, one not to publish a story, the other one to publish a story, a hacking inquiry that has convulsed News International. And the point, I want to make a very, very simple point to you. Nobody should be surprised by the convulsions going on in British journalism. For a very simple reason. We live in a more open society than ever before, where all institutions have to be more accountable, and that is a very wrenching transition for institutions, whether the BBC or News International or other media organisations, that have previously operated, if you like, in the shadows. And I just want to try and explain that a bit. One, the idea that we're living in a more open society than ever before. Now, I think that the starting point for this is not a Danish or a British question, but a global question. The world is not just a global village, but it's a more open global village than ever before. 30 years ago, people used to talk about the open society in the West and the closed society in the East. There's no such thing as a closed society anymore. I mean, even Burma has, the waters of openness have reached. North Korea, I suppose you could say, is the last closed society in the world. But essentially, across the world, more educated people have been more conscious of their rights, more willing to assert them, and more able to assert them, above all because of the flow of information. And this is transforming democratic countries, which I'll come to in a minute. It's also transforming undemocratic and autocratic countries. In my view, the Arab Spring is essentially a legitimacy crisis in the Middle East. The accountability of power has been called by the people and it's been found wanting. Mubarak was kleptocratic, corrupt, as well as undemocratic, inefficient, and leading Egypt nowhere. And he suffered a legitimacy crisis. And it was only possible because it's a more open society. Because information was available about what he was doing and not doing. So globally, we can come to this in China as well, but the Chinese leaders are very conscious that they're living in a more open society where more information is available and so around the world there's a more open society. What is the heart of the open society? I think there are two aspects. One is that everyone's able to express their opinion. It's dangerous, difficult for you. Everyone can be a journalist or a broadcaster these days. They get a flip phone, they get a blog. Suddenly anyone is able to express their opinion, and sometimes, even in 140 characters, they can have millions of followers. I'm sorry to say this. They may even have more followers than read your newspapers or watch your TV or listen to my speeches. So part of the definition of an open society is that everyone has an opinion and is able to express it. But there's another side to the open society that I think explains the convulsions in British media, and that is that power is held accountable in new ways. That what was previously secret means that were justified by ends are no longer secret. Hierarchies that made decisions in unaccountable ways are suddenly held accountable. And the bar for the legitimate exercise of authority has been raised. That's true in politics. I would argue it's true in business as well, but it's also true in the media. So what was going on in respect of hacking, which was illegal, is in the end exposed. Now, there's an irony in that it was in part exposed, significant part exposed, by another part of the media. So the historic function of the media, which is to expose the abuse of power, is being turned on itself. And actually the hacking has gone far wider than even the Guardian's original investigation revealed, which focused on News International. But that which was previously expected to be secret is now open. Texts between the Chief Executive of News International and the Prime Minister suddenly become public knowledge, and in the end everything comes out, and everything has to be justified. In the case of the BBC, an organisation which I think is you just have to watch the American election coverage to realise the value of having a BBC, for probing, in-depth, tough questioning, but that probing, in-depth, tough questioning can be turned on the executive of the BBC, because every institution has to be held accountable. And a public service broadcaster can't hold politicians accountable unless it's willing to hold its own bosses accountable. So I would say that the new normal that the media is having to come to terms with is that it can't just criticise other people's behaviour, it's got to account for its own behaviour. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the media has to live up to certain standards of legality, public interest, probity, that previously were aside from scrutiny. And in the same way that MPs and politicians and businesses have to account for themselves in the open society, so the media has to account for itself in the open society. And I think what's interesting about this new world that we live in, that I inhabit as a politician, that you inhabit as journalists, is there's actually only one cardinal sin. There's one sin that is above all others. And that is not the sin of making mistakes, it's the sin of hypocrisy. You can get away with most things as long as you're not a hypocrite. It's if you're seen to be saying one thing in public and doing another in private, that you get done in. That if you're seen to stand for certain definitions of the public interest in one way, but that you fuel others in another. In the case of the BBC, that you stand for fact-checking and care about publishing stories, in contrast to the unregulated blogosphere. But then it turns out you put out a story that named someone from the 1980s in a child abuse case, and it turns out to be wrong. You haven't done your proper due diligence. So the first point I would make to you is that the way, in my view, to understand what's going on in British media, and it is a convulsion, is that British media is suffering the sort of transparency challenge that the rest of society suffers as well. And never forget that this isn't just about high-minded ideas of public probity, it's also about economics. My industry suffers from declining trust and declining levels of voting. Your industry, if I may say so, at least the industry of your peers, certainly in print journalism in the UK, suffers from declining trust and declining numbers of people who want to buy newspapers. And the economics are part of this. The economics of the car industry are very similar to the economics of the European car industry, are very similar to the economics of British print journalism. There are too many journals for the number of people who are willing to buy it. And that crunch fueled, in my view, the culture of contempt that grew for the law and for politics, that was evident in the hacking scandal. And that culture of contempt found its ultimate nadir in law-breaking of a pretty fundamental kind. So the first, we can come back to the next question about it, so the first thing I want to just say is that what's going on is a shift from an old normal to a new normal, and the new normal is about transparency, hypocrisy is the cardinal sin, everything comes out, everyone's got an opinion, everything has to be accountable. Second point, this development of an open society is only one of the 5 great revolutions that are transforming the world. And any one of them deserves a conference of its own. I can't do them justice, but I just want you to have in your head, if you want to understand the modern world, it seems to me you have to understand 5 things. 1, the growth of the open society in a profound and deep way, radical democratization. Second point, the shift of economic power from west to east that's going on is of a scale and of a speed that's never been seen before. 50 million people a year are joining the global middle class in Asia. Let me just say that again. The population, 10 times the population of Denmark, is going from being poor to being middle class. Middle class in this context means earning $6,000 to $18,000 a year, according to the UN. 50 million people a year are joining the global middle class, essentially in India and China alone. And this is an economic transformation, the scale and speed of which has never been seen before. I mean, empires have come and gone, as those of us who are British know, but the notion that the relative decline of the West is happening at such a speed is a revolution that affects everything. And we'll come back to it. Third great revolution is the shift from resource plenty to resource scarcity. I mean, from my generation and previous generations, we've lived in a world of resource plenty. In energy, we may still live in a world of resource plenty because of shale gas. I mean, there's unconventional gases that are being discovered mostly in America, but also in Eastern Europe. It's a big change. But overall, if you look at non-oil commodity prices, the fall in non-oil commodity prices over the 100 years up to the year 2000 has been overwhelmed by the rise in non-oil commodity prices since 2000. So before the credit crunch, there was a resource crunch. Third major revolution is going on, in part driven by population shift, but not only by that. Essentially, urbanization, the growth of the middle class, is fueling a crunch of resources that is very, very profound, and actually Denmark is an early pioneer of more sustainable living, is in an advantageous position in that respect. Fourth big change is much shorter term. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, if we'd been meeting, we would have said, or I would have said, look, the big issue in the Muslim world is how to beat global jihad. Because the Muslim world was being convulsed by a narrative of Western exploitation and domination that was dangerous and powerful. And 5, 10 years on, global jihad is being squashed and squeezed by a completely different narrative of political Islam. I mean, there's 1 billion people who live in Muslim-majority countries. There's another 200-300 million Muslims who live in the West. But the notion that political Islam, which takes its inspiration from the Quran but applies it through democratic politics, is now the central narrative in the Muslim and Arab world, is absolutely key. And the narrative does not blame the West for the problems of the Muslim world. It blames the leaders of the Muslim world. That's a massive change that's going on. Especially if you think about it, none of the problems of the world, whether climate change or global security or global economics, can be addressed without countries in the Gulf, countries like Indonesia being part of the solution. So fourth big change is within the Muslim world but affects the rest of us. Fifth big change, we're all in this together. We've moved from a world of independent nations to interdependent peoples. This has never happened in the world before. The interdependence before has meant trade interdependence or sometimes security interdependence between countries. But we are now in a world where 200-300 million people are moving around the world in any year, where health problems get pushed around the world, not just human health, but the trees that are being wiped out in the UK at the moment are part of globalization. So we're living in a world of interdependent peoples. And I think that if you want to understand global politics, you've got to understand that these 5 big revolutions are happening at the same time. Any one of them would be convulsive. They're all happening at the same time. And if you think about it, dealing with changes of that scale, it's not surprising that the world feels leaderless. I got to know Madeleine Albright, who was the US Secretary of State under the second Clinton administration. And she's got a really brilliant metaphor that I think is interesting for me and maybe interesting for you. She said, look, you've got to understand that international politics in the Cold War was like steering a ship through the Suez Canal. You had to drive very straight, you had to grip onto the steering wheel, and you could hardly see any water on either side. You just had to sort of go straight. And actually there was another ship coming in the opposite direction. And so it was essentially a zero-sum game. She then says that in the Cold War period of the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, international politics was like steering a ship in the English Channel. There was water all around you, but you could see the land, 26 miles from Dover to Calais, from UK to France, So people had their bearings. Now, she says, international politics is like steering a ship on the high seas. There's water all around you and no one can see the land. So they don't know which direction to steer. And I think that is a very it's not that the leaders have become less able than they used to be. It's that the coordinates are much less obvious than they used to be. And I think you should have that in mind if you want to understand some of the problems that are going on in global politics. Third point I just wanted to talk about is kind of an interesting one, which is that we've had the biggest financial crisis for 80 years. It's been a catastrophic market failure, I would argue. And you'd think, many people wrote, this was a crisis of capitalism. Suddenly, I was at a seminar on Friday and Saturday, and an extremely distinguished, not particularly left-wing economist said, look, we've all got to reread Marx. What Marx said about surplus labour is true. What Marx said about the tendency of markets to crash is true. But it's not the case that left-of-centre governments are being re-elected or left-of-centre oppositions are being elected. Since 2008, some governments of the centre-left have been elected in this country. You know that, Obama, etc. But also the centre-right, Sweden, Germany. You've got some successes with Cameron. You've got successes on that side. So the question is that surprising? And I would say to you, it's not actually surprising that the 2008 financial crisis has not rebounded to the centre-left for the following very simple reason. It's true that the 2008 financial crisis blew a massive hole in the argument of the right about efficient markets. But it's also resurrected a debate that is very dangerous for the left. And that debate is what I would call the fiscal crisis of the state. Those of you, you're all too young, I think, to remember that you may have studied in the 1970s, there was a debate about the fiscal crisis of the state. There was stagflation, unemployment and inflation, tax revenues were under pressure, oil prices had gone up, which hit the economies, state spending was going up, there was no way to cover it. And across the Western world, there was a debate about the fiscal crisis of the state. It's back. The debate about the fiscal crisis of the state is back, and it's not going to go away fast. In fact, it's probably not going to go away for quite a long time. Because what happened in Western countries after 2008 was that the bankruptcy in the private sector was socialised and brought onto the public sector balance sheet. And so, more or less, the national sovereign debts in OECD countries went from an average of 40 or 45% to an average of 70 or 75%. And paying off an extra 70% of debt is not something that's done, an extra 30% of debt, sorry, is not something that's done quickly. We're going to be having to pay off this debt for a very long time to come, and that is going to constrain fiscal policy. That would be a big enough thing, even without two other factors that are very, very significant. One is the ageing population, which is putting more pressure on public spending, and second is declining tax revenues because of global tax competition. So you've got this sort of scissors effect with spending demands going up, whether to pay off debt or to deal with an ageing population, and the tax base under pressure. So the left faces a very profound fiscal crisis. And it does so at a time when there is a correct debate about short-term macroeconomic management. It's not just that there's this structural problem of the fiscal crisis of the state. There's also, what do we do in the next 2-3 years to get our economies going? Now, I understand from just a little bit of talking yesterday, the Danish economy is sort of, it's getting a bit of growth, but you're in a neighbourhood where Europe is not growing, it's a tough time. But I think there is a big debate about how to understand the role of fiscal policy in supporting economic growth. And in Britain, if you want a lesson in economic masochism, just come and see what's happening. The claim of that austerity in the public sector would drive growth in the private sector has proven to be completely untrue. And we are in double-dip recession, some people fear a triple-dip recession, but essentially the absence of public support for demand means that at a time of public fear and low consumption, private deleveraging and refusal to invest, weak export markets, you've got a very obvious national income equation that means that if the public sector doesn't support the economy, and the economy goes backwards. So there is a Keynesian question, but there's also this structural question. And it seems to me that left of centre parties will only prosper if they address both the Keynesian question and the structural question. So the way I would put it is like this, and I think this is really important, so I'll try and explain it as clearly as possible. The current policy mix in Europe, which is basically a centre-right policy mix, and it's led from Germany, it's not just a German view, is what I would call pro-austerity, pro-reform. The centre-right is saying, you've got to slam the brakes on public spending, in fact you've got to cut it, that's austerity, and you've also got to shake up these labour markets, product markets, pension systems, and the rest. And it's not working, really. I mean, if you just look at what's happening in Greece and Spain, the euro crisis, far from getting better, is getting worse. Because growth is falling, debts are rising, they're stuck in this vicious circle where the bailouts have to get bigger, and I'll come to what the resolution will be. But you've got a pro-austerity, pro-reform position. Now, the temptation for the left is to be anti-austerity and anti-reform. And you hear that quite a lot. You hear quite a lot of anti-austerity because this pre-Keynesian economic view of even the Bundesbank or George Osborne is not working. But you also hear the left saying we've got to protect the welfare gains of the 1940s, we've got to have a defensive social democracy. Now, I don't think that will work. The sweet spot in politics is to be anti-austerity and pro-reform. Because the truth is, there are structural questions that require us to renegotiate the way in which the social contract is organised. We do have to get investment into the young, and we can't just use the welfare state to support the old. We do have to think about internationalisation of the economy in different ways. And it seems to me that you've got this traditional right that is pro-austerity, pro-reform, and a traditional left that is anti-austerity, anti-reform, and where you need to fill the space is anti-austerity in the short term, but pro-reform in the medium to long term. And in countries like France, I think that's evident. In countries like Britain, it's where I think you need to and that is the policy mix that I think allows the centre-left to avoid being pigeonholed as big state. Because the truth is, if you end up in a political debate of big state versus small state, the left often loses. If you can make it small state versus smart state, you can win. And so, look, I basically think New Labour is the right political position. I don't think we should spend our time bowing down to the gods of the 1990s and saying we're going to repeat what we did then, because the circumstances are very different. But we do have to understand that the political positioning of a reforming social democracy is the right position. Defensive social democracy doesn't win. Okay, final point. I've gone on for a slightly long one, but let me finish up on the following point. I make a case that's very unusual and hard to make. Why is Europe still the future? That looks like a not the most obvious case. But let me put it to you this way. First of all, the euro crisis is real. The leadership that's been shown to resolve it has been weak and ineffective. And things could get worse before they get better. Because the fundamental issues of the relationship between solvency and liquidity have not really been addressed. There's a real danger of an accident that means that Greece drops out of the euro. That's a real danger of such an accident. I don't think that's what European leaders want. You can have accidents in such volatile situations as exist at the moment. But I don't think it's a majority chance myself. I think that the commitment on the part of, when push comes to shove, there's a decision at the top of German society, but also other core European nations, that they're going to make this Euro 17 but nonetheless, the best scenario is that Europe has a very tough 5 years, but rebounds in the second half of the decade. Best scenario. So why is Europe the future? I think it's the future for a very simple reason. For the explanation I gave earlier, there isn't going to be great progress in global governance in the next few years. The rising powers in India and China and Brazil, they're looking inwards, actually, not outwards. We're not going to get big global settlements on massive questions of climate change, trade. We're not going to have big breakthroughs. And in the absence of big breakthroughs on global governance, regional association of governments is the obvious place to tackle the simple problem that the nation state is too small for some big problems. And so the logic that led to the creation of the European Union in the first place remains. I haven't been to Latin America recently, but if you study what's going on in Latin America, 4 countries there, Colombia, Peru, Chile and Mexico, which are not small countries, the combined GDP of those 4 countries is 20% greater than Brazil. So those 4 countries together deserve to be in this so-called BRICS category. Right? It's a big group. What are they doing? They're forming a sub-regional association based on the 4 freedoms at the heart of the European single market. And if you ask them, are you really thinking that at the end of all this, you're going to have then you have to whisper, single currency? They say, yes, we think a single currency is the logical outcome of our work. Now, they're taking the precaution of achieving economic convergence before the single currency to avoid the obvious problems that have plagued the euro. They're not going to have a euro, they're not going to have the equivalent currency of countries as diverse as those that entered the euro. But the logic of regional association is very, very strong. And I think that in the scenario where the euro survives, but also in the scenario where it doesn't, you're going to see a rebound towards pan-European action over the next decade. Because the logic for operating at that scale is overwhelming. Now, for Britain and for Denmark, there is a real danger. And that danger is that we drop out of certainly in the British case, and it's different for you, I think, but neither of us are in the euro. The danger is that the euro of 17 becomes the focal unit, not the EU of 27 and 28 when Croatia joined. And for Britain and for Denmark, there is an overwhelming imperative that we build links across the in-out divide between euro ins and euro outs. Now, unfortunately, for those of you who are Danish, realistic pro-Europeans, Britain is playing its cards all wrong at the moment. We're opting out of the debate. But if you listen to the current government, you believe that they think they're going to have more in common with Vietnam in 20 years' time than they're going to have with Germany. And it's actually not, it's not completely, it's worth taking seriously. Their argument is Vietnam's got 80 million people, it's growing at 9% a year. In the global village, we're all neighbours. Now, I think that's wrong. We'll never have as much in common with Vietnam, whether in economic terms and in political terms, as we do with Germany. But that is the argument that needs to be confronted. And at the moment in the Tory party, it's impossible to be a pro-European. I mean, every MP has to be reselected. And the tragedy of the Tory party is that every selection conference will ask, what is your position on Europe? And the only way to get votes is to be more and more extreme. Now, Labour's tragedy is to overdo it, but Labour's position is the opposite, and it's not especially healthy. Of the 600 Labour MPs who have to be selected next election, it'll be amazing if 10 get asked their position on Europe. So we have the equal and opposite lack of debate about Europe. The Tories have this passionate Eurosceptic debate. I prefer to be in our position than their position, but nonetheless I think it's kind of interesting. But nonetheless, those of us who think that the future is one which includes a Europe of 27, 28, that is a force in the world, that does reinforce the security and prosperity of its members, we need to figure out how to make sure that those of us who are not in the euro don't end up getting left out. And Britain needs to be part of that, I would argue. And we need to, the case I make is that on energy, migration, foreign policy, climate change, we actually make sure that the EU of 27 has non-Eurozone members as leading players in it. And that speaks to Denmark. We also have to say something to our own people, which is, I don't know if it's unpopular in Denmark, it's unpopular in the UK. The European Commission, the European Court of Justice, the institutions of the 27, we need to defend those institutions. We need those institutions to prevent the Europe of 27 being undermined by the interests of the 17 who are in the euro. We need to uphold the integrity of the Europe of 27, not just the interests of the 17 who are in the euro. So, 4 things about journalism, about politics, about Europe, and about the centre-left. Let me just finish on the following note, which is that if you think about it, traditional politics and traditional media are not very well suited to the world I've described. Traditional politics is hierarchical, it's slow-moving, it's operates in broadcast, not dialogue. It's about machine rather than movement. And so we shouldn't be surprised that traditional parties of centre-left and centre-right are under a lot of challenge because the ideologies of state and of market don't seem appropriate to a world where the prosperous and secure economies are those that have different forms of the social market economy, really. But traditional media is also under threat in this world because it's also about broadcast, it's also about experts, it's also about one-way traffic. And so in a way, as I was thinking about coming to talk to you, the challenges for media leaders are not that different than they are for politicians. It's how to get relevance, leverage, and locus at a time when power has leaked from traditional political institutions and traditional media institutions. I actually think there are massive opportunities for politics in this. I haven't really thought it through from the media side, and the economics of it are very difficult. But I think that the opportunity of an open society to renew politics is actually very strong indeed, and that's why politics, I think, still has a fascination and a drive that makes you all cover it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for that very interesting speech. Now, this is your chance to ask David Miliband about whatever you would like to ask him about. I think I'll start with the first question, actually. And I think we should start in what's going on right now. Actually, it goes with your last point about the BBC. Of course, George Entwistle, as we've heard, has left the BBC. There are calls now for other leaders of the BBC to go. Indeed, of a review of the whole role played by the BBC. I think for many of us journalists, the BBC has been sort of the international gold standard for many years. What do you think will happen to the BBC, and do you think it will be for the better or wrong?
I think this is not an existential crisis for the BBC. I don't think. In a way, it doesn't compare to the sort of fights it had in the 80s with Mrs. Thatcher. It's funding based, £3 billion a year is pretty secure. No one's debating the future of the licence fee, which is a remarkable insulation. I mean, under the government I was part of, there was a big increase in the licence fee to sponsor the drive into digital. Any of you who watched the Olympics coverage would have seen extraordinary quality of coverage. Anyone who goes on the website, I mean, it's just it's the best of the blogosphere and the best of the traditional media in a way. But I think that what it's got is a management structure that is risk averse and a culture that is still very isn't really attuned to the fast-moving world that we live in. And it's a bit unfair to pick on this guy, but I mean, for him to say he's the Director General of the BBC, but he didn't know that one of his flagship programme was putting out a second programme on child abuse is pretty, it's pretty extraordinary, really. And it's one thing for him to say, I didn't see their tweet announcing that they were doing this programme, but then to say, no one told me that the programme and I was out at dinner, I mean, that's just not, that's a sort of, we're in a world of rolling news, you can't be in a world of only listening to the news once a day. So I think that there'll be changes in the senior management, but without wishing to be complacent, I think that I haven't heard anyone across the political spectrum saying what this proves is that we shouldn't have a public service broadcaster. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of, Daily Mail, News International, Daily Telegraph piling in against the BBC, which they accuse of being liberal. I mean, it seems to me that in the modern world, if you respect facts, that makes you a liberal. But I mean, or at least in the eyes of the right, it does. But I mean, Obama said that Romney was waging a war on facts. And I think the BBC takes facts at best pretty seriously, and it just hasn't in this case. So I think hard cases make bad law, and I don't think that this is an existential crisis for the BBC. I think its senior management will change, but I don't think that. I think that the argument that they've got top-heavy management is probably true, but I don't think that means that the institution is at risk.
Right. So not the end of the line, BBC. Any other questions for David Miliband? Please.
Yes, I'd like to ask about...
Maybe I think you should just introduce yourself, so David knows.
I'm on Scandal from Against Broadcasting, and I'd like to know about your opinion on Rupert Murdoch, because he's been the one that's halfway elected Prime Ministers of Britain over the last few decades. So to what extent has he really abused his power?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this may seem rude in an audience of journalists. The media is much less important than journalists think and than politicians think. So I said earlier there was a culture of contempt on the part of culture of contempt has been exposed in the hacking scandal, but there was also it was met by a culture of fear on the part of politicians. But the truth is that the media was not as important as we both thought. I mean, it's impossible for 29% of people who read the Daily Mail to vote Labour, which they do. It's impossible to recognise that and believe that the media are as important as they think they are. Because if you read the Daily Mail for 3 days, never mind for 3 years, I don't see how you can end up voting Labour, but people do. And people buy newspapers for all sorts of reasons. Now, secondly, in respect of Murdoch, I think you can make a strong case that he followed fashion rather than created it. So he jumped on the new Labour bandwagon, and he jumped off the Labour bandwagon, but after his own readers had moved. And it's true that they piled into Labour in 1992, but I haven't seen data that proves that Labour would have won in 92 unless the Murdochs had piled in. Now, there's the third thing, which is separate and different, which is about criminality. Now, there's police and prosecution, there's prosecutions going. There's been police inquiries and now prosecutions taking place of senior people in news and data. That is a separate thing, it seems to me. That raises pretty important questions about the culture of an organisation and where it polices the boundaries between the legal search for informing the public and the illegal crossing of the boundary to criminal activity, which is what very serious criminal activity that's now being alleged. And then there's a fourth and final point, which is about cross-media ownership and all of that. I mean, I think what's interesting at the moment is how, this is the problem in politics, how fragmented the media environment is. Now, our sort of 10 o'clock news, I don't know what your equivalent would be, it probably has 7 or 8 million viewers on the BBC, 6 or 7 million viewers, 5 or 6 million viewers on ITV. And that's a lot, but we're a population of 60 million. So we've got a very fragmented media environment. And that's why it takes a different kind of politics to engage with it. And I think that one of the tests of media ownership now is about concentration versus fragmentation. And the BBC is obviously the most powerful broadcaster, but it's constrained by these rules on public service broadcasting and political neutrality, which I think you have the same for your Danish broadcasters here. And so, I think that's the final and separate question. But I think the third point about illegality is of a different order. The politics, the first point, I think you've got to slightly rise above that. Howard Wilson said that sailors shouldn't complain about the sea and politicians shouldn't complain about the media.
Another question? Yes, please. If we just get the microphone as well.
Hi, my name is Lene Rast, and I'm a teacher at journalism school in Denmark. I'd like to ask you, what
you're really asking about print journalism, aren't you? Because broadcast journalism is already regulated in the UK. So you're asking about print journalism. Personally, I think self-regulation has passed its sell-by date. In the 1990s, the last time the Press Complaints Commission was renewed, it was said the press are in a last chance saloon. But honestly, they carried on drinking in the last chance saloon, like there was no, like the beer was never going to run out. And I don't think you can make the case for that self-regulation works. The argument now is, will statutory underpinning, legal underpinning of independent oversight that guarantees the interests of private citizens, including various forms of redress, monetary and publicity redress, is that solution worse than having ineffective self-regulation? Now, and part of that argument is, look, if criminal activity is taking place, then the law should take care of it. I don't think that the case is yet proven that statutory underpinning, for example, a law which said national print media to gain various rights have got to sign up to the following code, and the code is overseen by independent people who are not elected by, not nominated by government. I don't see the case that that is injurious to the free press, because the free press is an essential part of a free society. Now, there are two questions about it, really. One, will it undermine the freedom of the press? I don't see why it necessarily should. And you can imagine how it would. If the government ministers were appointing overseers, then, yeah, you could make the case. But I think that you could find ways of doing that are completely independent of government. There's a second case, which is in the world of the blogosphere, social media, this is just shutting the door after a horse has bolted. And why should print media of decent reputation be patrolled, if you like, or regulated in a way that the blogosphere isn't? And I think that comes down to the question of how power is now held accountable. And power cannot be held accountable through self-accountability, I think. I don't see how that works. If you want to make sure, if you believe that what's gone on in terms of the invasion of the interests of private citizens is not just immoral but needs to be stopped, you've got two routes. One is to say there's criminal acts, and the other is to say there are non-criminal acts. Now, you can easily imagine the invasion of privacy that involves nothing criminal, and that may involve the publication of things that aren't true, but they're not illegal, and they may not be slanderous or libelous. And those are the circumstances that you're trying to protect. Now, that's the debate we're having at the moment. Should we rely on a criminal law, or would it be better to have some kind of envelope within which print journalism works? We'll see what Leveson suggests, but I haven't seen the case that it's necessarily the case that statutory underpinning is, by definition, an encumbrance on the free press.
More questions? I've got a question for you. There's this supposed open society, in this supposed open society, the press role in this society, of course, is changing as well. Will the press, as we know it, will the people sitting here, will we become irrelevant at some stage? Do you think we could have a time when the sort of classical way of approach to journalism will not be as relevant today?
Well, I think the classical approach to journalism is finished. I mean, I don't know, those of you who are print journalists here, in the UK, if you're a print journalist in the UK, you're also doing blogs, you're also doing commentary on the websites of the papers. In that sense, the idea that you write for a 7 o'clock deadline, and then that's it, you go, I think that's over. It's a much more multimedia environment. Having said that, the premium on good writing may actually rise, not fall. The premium on good broadcasting will rise, not fall. The means for good broadcasting and good writing to be seen globally is rising, not falling. So I would say you're in a much more competitive environment, but you're also in an environment where you can have more power, not less. I mean, if you're not restricted to, especially if you're writing in English, you're not restricted to the residents of your own community. And so it's the fact that it's a global space is extraordinary. I mean, I've got 105,000 followers on Twitter, and I would guess a quarter of them are foreign. Now, that doesn't mean they see everything that I put out. And by the way, it's at Miliband if you want to. So hopefully I've got a few more foreign ones as a result of this escapade. I think that it's more competitive, but potentially more rewarding, would be the way I would put it. I don't think you're out of business at all, because public hunger for information, entertainment, stimulus, interest, the curiosity of the public is growing, not falling. And your business is about satisfying that curiosity, either for expertise or for entertainment or for new knowledge or for new connections. I think what does change is that the means of production now exist in everybody's hand. So we can, I think there's a Korean newspaper called Everyone a Journalist or something, and it sort of takes submissions from everywhere. What you, I think, have to offer is higher quality. But I think that, I think actually as I think about it, if anything, it's a more powerful set of opportunities.
One question, just how much more time have we got? Everybody, 5 minutes. 5 minutes? So at least time for one more question, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, it's Peter Asgaard, my name, I'm a freelancer. Could you imagine, with the changes in the British media, with the changes in politics, with the changes of public approach to the politicians and morality, could you imagine a profumo scandal in Britain today? I mean, we have Petraeus in America just now stepping down just because he had a mistress. Nothing wrong in that. But could you imagine that in Britain now?
I hope your wife's not. Look, I don't want to say anything. I don't know, is this on the record or off the record?
This is surely off the record, I mean, it's journalists.
I assume that everything I've said has been on the record, but let me just say this off the record. Because I don't want to comment on this, but in a way that I don't like to talk about the Petraeus, in a way it's a bit unfair, but what I'd say about that, it's not, the issue was not that he had a mistress. The issue was that his code and his standing was defending a code that said you don't do that. So it was the hypocrisy point. You see what I mean? I mean, I don't want to, I'm really not commenting on it publicly, but it seems to me that, I mean, that's the point. You can't defend a code that says you will not do something and then do it. If the code doesn't say that, then you can get away with it. Now, the Profumer affair, most people here are far too young to know what this was. In 1963, under the Macmillan government, before I was born, there was a government minister who had an affair with a woman who'd also had an affair with an East German agent, I think it was the more or less. And she was quite a good-looking woman. And and she was... Now, he was forced to resign because of the suggestion that he might have compromised government secrets. I mean, that's still pretty serious. Even if you're an unmarried minister, if you ended up with someone who was a spy, that's a pretty big story. And it's an unwise choice of partner, I think. So, could the Profumo affair, what I would say about the Profumo affair, if you have got a mistress, it'll come out far, it'll come into the public domain faster than it did in those days, and so will all the sordid details of the man or the woman that you're having an affair with. Now, the question is, would you have to resign? You'd only have to resign, I think, if you'd violated the hypocrisy code or the security code. And I mean, yeah, I think that's the point. Look, present yourself as the epitome of family values and then you don't practice them, then you're in trouble.
I think just on the very final note, I would like to ask David, at least, you know, to the rest of the followers of British politics here, where do you see yourself in 5 years and 10 years? Are we going to see you back in the front benches? Are you going elsewhere? What is the plan?
Not sure, really. The open society means that anything can happen, really. I think that, I'm learning about different kinds of politics. One of the things I've done is create a charity called the Movement for Change, which is training community leaders around Britain. We're training 10,000 community leaders to make change in their own community. So people are taking action against domestic violence, they are organising shopkeepers to improve security around their shops, they're mobilising pensioners to improve healthcare. It's a really bottom-up politics, and that's movement politics in a way. Equally, I obviously want the Labour Party to get back into power, and there's big work to be done on ideas and mobilisation there. And equally, finally, the international sphere. I think that one of the things for Western politicians at the moment, I didn't get time to talk about this, but I think you and we, if we are the sort of internationalist, cosmopolitan end of the market, I think there's a real danger that after 15, 20 years when anti-globalization looked like it was something that was coming in the developing world, there's a real danger now that anti-globalization is going on in the West. And I think politicians like me who are pragmatic and hard-headed internationalists, we need to find ways to make that felt, because if the decline of the West is about relative economic decline, that's one thing. If it's about some of the Western norms and commitments about human rights, about sustainable development that are lost internationally, that's a disaster. And I think that we have a democracy promotion. I think we've got a big job to do to stand up for a West that remains engaged internationally. Because the predicament of the West is that we are, once you've been the top dog, it looks like there's only one place to go. And that's not up. And I think that if the West turns against globalization, turns inwards, we'll make ourselves less prosperous and less secure. And I think we have a real job to do to make the case that engaging globally can be productive, and that, I'm interested in that as well. So I'm not sure, which is probably not the best answer, but it's open. It's open.
I think we should put our hands together for David.